Hello again. I've been very surprised that nobody has mentioned the Danish West Indies as the debate about Greenland's future hops up. What's that? You didn't know that Denmark had a colony in the Caribbean where slaves worked on plantations? Of course you didn't, because it doesn't really fit in with the modern narrative when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade, which cast only Britain and the United States as being complicit in the so-called triangular trade. I'll come back to that in a moment, but first let me explain the connection between the Danish West Indies and the current crisis about Greenland. I've spoken before of the Monroe Doctrine formulated in the early 19th century. This was that the western hemisphere of the Earth, including the whole of the Atlantic Ocean, was America's concern, and that European powers should steer clear of it and allow America a free hand there. For almost a century after it was first propounded, the Monroe Doctrine formed the cornerstone of American foreign policy. The Atlantic Ocean acted as a cordon sanitaire, protecting America from the contagion of the tribal politics which was felt to bedevil Europe. This determination of keeping clear of wars, or even binding treaties with European nations, became known as isolationism, and although the term is sometimes used in connection with countries other than the United States, isolationism is most often thought of as an American tendency. This then is the context in which the proposed annexation of Greenland must be viewed. America will not tolerate European nations occupying territory between the continental United States and the European mainland. Until a little over a century ago, Denmark had two possessions which were closer to North America than they were Europe. One of these was Greenland, and another was a collection of Caribbean islands known as the Danish West Indies. Throughout the 19th century, the United States eyed both these territories as belonging rightfully in their own sphere of influence. Indeed, at that time, Greenland was actually thought to be part of the North American continent rather than an island. Offers were made to Denmark by both Greenland and the Danish West Indies, but it wasn't until the First World War that agreement was reached. In 1917, the Danish West Indies became the US Virgin Islands after America paid $25 million to Denmark. You see now why the idea of the United States buying Greenland is not quite as outlandish as it might appear today. There is precedent for such a transaction. It's all well and good for Denmark to go on now about the rights of the people of Greenland, but they didn't care so much about the rights of those living in the Dutch West Indies when they sold them to the United States. Going off on a slight tangent, it's interesting to note that Denmark was involved in slavery and the slave trade from West Africa to the Caribbean for longer than Britain. They began taking slaves there in 1657, and slavery was not abolished on the island until 1848. For comparison, Britain's official involvement with the transatlantic slave trade began only in 1660 with the establishment of the Royal African Company. There had been individual and small-scale actions before that by individual British ships, but it was only in 1660 that the business really got going. Before that, Britain had relied upon the Dutch for the supply of slaves to their Caribbean colonies. Britain abolished slavery in its possessions there in 1833, 15 years before Denmark decided to do the same. I mention this in passing because nobody seems to be urging Denmark to pay reparations to the inhabitants of the Virgin Islands. It's only Britain which faces such demands. The problem of Greenland remained, though, because from a geopolitical perspective, Greenland might very well be regarded as part of North America. The so-called GIUK, that is to say the seas between Britain and Iceland and Greenland, are of tremendous strategic importance militarily because they allow Russian ships to sail from Murmansk, Archangel, and the Baltic Ocean into the North Atlantic and from there to the coast of the United States. Greenland is vital for the security of America. Ultimately, if not this year, then next. And if not then perhaps in 5 or 10 years' time, the United States will acquire ownership of Greenland, and this will be, in a sense, the final part of the jigsaw puzzle, which will enable America to feel completely secure, at least on its east coast. Rather than being a harebrained scheme dreamt up by an unstable old man, the purchase of Greenland will be in effect tidying up some unfinished business which has been neglected by successive presidents since the end of the Second World War. I thought I would talk about the Danish West Indies this morning because it illustrates perfectly something which I have long noticed, which is that most people like to have a very simple and straightforward historical narrative to which they can refer. It must be a fairly simple and easily understood one. The case of the Dutch West Indies is never mentioned in the news because it makes the question of both the American acquisition of Greenland and also the history of the transatlantic slave trade unnecessarily complicated. On the one hand, we like to pretend that there is something grotesque about the idea of America buying a chunk of land belonging to Denmark. This sounds bizarre and enables us to laugh at President Trump for his arrogance. Knowing that such a thing has happened before rather spoils the narrative and makes the idea of buying Greenland look less odd. It also harms the simple story about the transatlantic slave trade, which cast Britain and the United States as the chief villains. Learning that Denmark was mixed up in the game for longer than Britain was makes that narrative as well seem less clear-cut and obvious. For both these reasons, you will not be seeing any mention of this subject in your newspapers or indeed on the television news in the days to come. I will confess I have been slightly surprised that no one has so far mentioned the Danish West Indies because they are such an integral part of the whole question of the hope for proposed annexation of Greenland that I'm not sure how it's possible for anybody to understand what's now happening in the news if they didn't know about the previous purchase of the Dutch West Indies from Denmark, the Danish West Indies from Denmark. Still, there it is. I thought at least that viewers of this channel might want to be a little bit better informed than the average newspaper reader.